imagine never needing to buy compost for your garden again. It sounds like the dream, right? But it is possible. I'm here to tell you it is possible. It's not all sunshine and rainbows, but it can be done. And I want to give you this garden as an example. This garden has been self-sufficient in compost for 2 growing seasons now, and it is just continuing to get better as time progresses. Now there is one exception, which is to do with raising seedlings in modules, which I'm happy to go through in another video. But in terms of bed, in-ground fertility, both in the polytunnel, in the garden, I don't need to source any external compost. And so here are the 9 main lessons that I've learned that hopefully will help you reduce that feeling of either being dependent on compost or feel like you might not have enough, just to show you that there's kind of more than one path up the mountain. The first thing that I've learned is that it's totally okay to have a growing season where some of your beds you don't put down extra fertility. And so there's an example here. I've got this bed, and this soil is beautiful. It is deep, it is dark, it looks good. And that's what you're looking for as a soil. It is that. You've got all of that compost application. There's a lot put down last year because there are a lot of hungry crops growing in here, like tomatoes and squash. I've just been through and weeded this, and I'm about to mulch this. I used weeds almost as like a living green manure over winter. But what I've decided is it's okay to not put some compost down on this, and what I can do instead is a bit of a hierarchy. So this is a very basic rule of thumb that you can take home and use in your garden, but it's in terms of how hungry certain crops are. So in general, fruiting crops are the hungriest, so those are ones that absolutely do want quite a bit of compost. So those are going to be things like tomatoes and your squash. The middle ground is more of the roots, so these are your things like beetroot and carrots. They don't want too much fertility or need too much fertility, but they don't want low fertility. It's trying to find that middle ground. And then the things that need the least fertility are the leaves. The leaves need the least. These are leaves like your salads, your spinach, a little bit of your kales. Now it doesn't always work. Something like a cauliflower is very hungry, but a general rule of thumb is fruit are the hungriest, roots are middle, leaves the least. And so here's a little plan of action if you feel, okay, maybe I'm going to struggle with compost this year. Well, simplify it. For your hungriest crops, give those the usual compost you would. Then use about half the compost for the middle hungry crops. And then don't worry about putting compost down for your leafy greens, and I would include things like herbs as well. And that's also where you could grow your flowers. Like flowers, they don't need that really high fertility. So if you can just organise that a bit, suddenly you massively reduce the amount of compost that you need. And then the following year, that would kind of rotate. So where you've had the leaves, that's then when you put on your nice amount of compost and grow your hungry things the following season. The second lesson is, if you can't put down compost to add that fertility over your beds, of course you can use other types of mulch. But if you're like, I need a little bit of extra fertility, then all you need to do, whenever, this here is a Dorberton's kale, variegated, and this is a very generous handful of compost. And this is just as an example. It could be the same if you're growing, say, a squash. I know Penny Edica, with her supercharged compost, she says that she uses the equivalent of a bean can to put under her squash plants or her tomato plants as that like super fertility. We're putting the fertility actually where the roots want to be. And so instead of putting the fertility on the top and letting nature over time bring it down, what you can do is target that fertility exactly where it's needed. So I've got this bed here that I'm actually turning into a perennial salads bed, which will be quite fun. And Dorberton kale is a lovely one to add. And so all I'm going to do is dig a deeper hole than usual, fill this at the base, then transplant that, water it in, and it is good to go. And it means even if you've got like a clump of beetroot or things like that, it's okay just to put a bit of compost underneath to feed the roots rather than always putting it over the top of your beds. Next up has been the value of having a worm bin in the garden. The great thing about a worm bin is that for either certain types of cooked food and stuff that you might not want to put in a compost bin and attract rats, you can put into a worm bin and they can convert it into 2 products for you. Firstly, you have the liquid feed, which comes out of the tap. Maybe not as exciting as beer coming out of a tap, but still it's something that you can tap and feed your tomato plants. And then you also have the the worm castings, the vermicompost, the worm I've been to Austria, so my German is still a little bit in my head at the moment. But you've got the worm castings, and they are so potent in terms of fertility. And what I was saying in the last tip about putting a handful of compost, well, if you add a small handful of worm castings at the base, or mix that in with your homemade compost to the base of a plant, if you're planting a tomato or something, it is going to supercharge them. So these worms, they're essentially a livestock. I'm farming worms and feeding them, and as a result I get two products that can help me grow better fruit and veg. Now the fourth lesson is understanding that composting it's all about your situation, context, a case-by-case basis, and that everything in life is a certain trade-off, and that if you would rather not source material and buy compost, then okay, you have a trade-off of not being self-sufficient in compost, but at least you might save a lot of your time or effort or stress. And everything has mental value, not just monetary value. And so trying to bear that in mind as we're approaching things. And I'll give you a perfect example. Right in front of me here is a hotbed. It was last season's hotbed. I'm about to extract all of the compost from it. And this took effort to make. I had to go and I had to do a couple of trips to a local farm because I found a local farm where I could get horse manure with shreddings, and then we put leaves in and all these different things. It did take a good day's worth of effort, but as a result, not only did I, and this is about stacking functions, not only did I get a lovely amount of compost, I got a massive amount of crops out of season. I got all of my salads going in February and March without needing any external heat or external lighting, and then I got more crops throughout the season and a huge amount of squash, and it was a lot of fun. And so really it's like there's no right or wrong. Compost self-sufficiency is down to you. You could choose to be self-sufficient in compost it's a bit like the Self-Sufficiency Garden, but be self-sufficient in compost for like a certain amount or a certain quantity, or just for your outside beds, and to not beat yourself up about it. I think it's very easy to get into that sense of I feel like I'm not doing enough, I'm not a good enough gardener, I don't make enough compost. It is about trade-off. If you're willing to put in the effort to source the materials, then that's great. But if you struggle, then don't worry about it. And I think that needs to be said more often. Now this isn't part of the main video, so you can skip to this timestamp to carry on. But if you are interested in trying to unlock all of the potential of your garden, for example, what I mentioned there with hotbed stacking functions, everything in the garden serves more than one purpose. And the better we can understand each element, the more productive and more resilient our garden becomes. So if you like this kind of thinking, then you're going to love permaculture. Permaculture is nature-inspired design. I packed everything I possibly could into this book to show you how to grow in harmony with nature to produce an abundance of food. One of the goals in permaculture is to produce a surplus. It's not about producing enough, it's producing a surplus. So if this interests you, then you might want to grab a copy. So next up is something that I think is pretty clever, and it has reduced the amount of compost that I need to buy for propagating seedlings. And so really the compost is minimal that I'm using now just for raising seedlings. Part of that is also helped by direct sowing more, so I don't even need that compost in the first place. Now this, let's pretend that this plant here is grown on in a module and it's a bit early in the season, or there's not quite enough space in the garden to plant it out, or you're waiting for something. What you can do is you can borrow soil. So this soil here, this bed, it is fertile, it's nice and deep. And so what you can do is take some soil and you can then plant that plant, grow it on a bit, and then when you transplant it back into that bed, like 6 to 8 weeks later, you're just returning all of that other soil and you haven't had to go out and buy more compost. And this alone has been one of the biggest cost-saving things that I've done in recent times. This next lesson has been quite the game changer for me, because it was a realization that perennial crops don't need compost. You can definitely get away with just mulching loads instead, and that slow burn or slow release fertility. If you can find certain types of really productive perennial vegetables, like different types of tubers like oca, mashua, sunchokes, also perennial kales, like this purple tree collard. By having a greater ratio of the garden dedicated to perennials, and this includes fruit, so I've got a thornless blackberry here as well, the greater ratio, the greater percentage of your growing space that is taken up with perennials, the less total compost that your garden needs. And so it means that the compost you are making can be concentrated to smaller areas which are more intensive for those hungry vegetables. I feel at the moment, when we talk about composting, there's a lot of discussion about hot composting, and it's kind of like the sexy thing to do in gardening. But very often, the simple, kind of boring thing sometimes is best, or at least offers things that can be overlooked because it's not as attractive and cool and steamy. So here is my cold compost bin setup. It's very simple, 2 bins. In here, this produced around, I actually measured it, worked out the volume, 0.7 cubic meters of compost, so 700 litres of compost. So that is a lot of compost. And so I've been starting to go through of this compost, putting it on beds, not as a mulch, but to add fertility, and then mulching over the compost. So the compost is an amendment for the soil, and then I'm mulching over it. I am learning, and there is a video coming out about that, which will be interesting. But slow composting, it just works really well, and it is sometimes the best suited thing. If you don't have the volumes of material coming out all of the time, which you need to make a hot compost bin or a hotbed, then just a couple of slow compost bins where you do one, once that's ready you start filling the other one, and it just rotates each year, or twice a year. It's so simple, it's boring, but it works beautifully. Alright, so I kind of alluded to it in the last one, which I said I'm going to do a whole video about, which I am. It's going to be a response video to the controversial video I made last November, about not respecting compost enough. But I am hands down going to say that is my biggest lesson, was I was asking too much of compost. I was looking at compost not just for adding fertility, but mulching to protect the soil, to cut down on weeds, all of these different things, insulation, etc. And it works, but you need a lot of compost. Now, there's no such thing as too much homemade compost, but I don't know a single gardener who's ever complained about having too much compost. So I think that says a lot in itself. And so my big lesson has been, instead of asking too much of compost, is instead thinking, where can I put, compost is so precious. I treat compost as perhaps the most precious thing here in this garden. Well, maybe my leeks are more precious, but I'm Welsh and so that's allowed. But second to leeks is compost. And so because it's precious, I want to make sure that when I am using it, I'm using it right. I'm using it at the right time. And it has had to be quite a big mindset shift for me. But I'm pleased with it. It feels a lot better. The biggest thing is I no longer feel like I don't have enough compost. And I could mulch all of these beds with the compost in here that I've produced if I want to, and that's totally cool. But I do feel that how compost is valued is part of a wider discussion that needs to be had in the gardening world, especially here in the UK. And I really hope that video coming out soon, where I'm responding to a lot of these different comments, will at least be quite thought-provoking, because it's certainly made me think a lot. My last lesson is, if you don't have enough space for a compost bin, look at composting in your pathways. I've done a couple of videos about this. I do think it is one of the most helpful things for people with small gardens. So the video is right here. It is so simple to do, but it is really effective and helps ease that pressure of having to, even if you're in an urban environment, having to go and buy compost bags and bring them back, and if you don't have a car, that's hard. So pathway composting.